Good morning, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us for the State of Housing webinar. Today, the Center for Housing and Neighborhoods at the Kinder Institute for Urban Research published the 2025 State of Housing in Harris County and Houston report, made possible with the support of Wells Fargo. So to help us unpack our findings, we've invited three expert panelists, and we invite you to share your own questions. You may submit questions at any time using the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. You can also vote on questions to push them to the top of the list. And as time allows, we will address audience questions near the end of our Q&A portion. And some questions will be answered directly in the chat by a member of our team. So in addition to building on key indicators from previous years, this year's report has a special focus on disasters, resilience, and environmental risks at the neighborhood level. This is especially important as we've learned from the Kinder Institute's Houston Population Research Center that more than 80% of residents think that it is likely that climate change will have serious effects on their health, their financial situation, and on Houston's prosperity as a whole. In addition, we know that rising utilities, disasters, and insurance rates are contributing to a situation where 2 out of 3 residents have challenges paying for their housing costs. Now, to dig deeper into the findings from our State of Housing report, I will turn the webinar over to our research scientist, Steve Sherman.
Thank you, Caroline Chong, Associate Director of Housing and Neighborhoods at the Kinder Institute, for that introduction. And thank you all for attending this webinar this morning. So to begin with the core affordability indicators, the cost of housing isn't getting any cheaper. Between the two most recent American Community Surveys, median gross rent in the city of Houston went up 9% in only 1 year. That is higher than inflation for that time period, and unsurprisingly, the number of cost-burdened renter households in Harris County, that is households paying more than 30% of their income on rent, the number of those households went up 15,000 in just 1 year, meaning more households more crunched in their monthly budgets. The price of homes for sale also went up, though slightly less, only 3%. And the affordability gap, or the gap between a home a median income household can afford in the city and the actual home median sales prices in the city, continued to increase, as it has most every year since we started measuring at the start of last decade. We also used assessor data to map assessed land value and its increase across many Harris County neighborhoods. And we identified 7 neighborhoods where the median parcel land value more than tripled in only 5 years. All of these neighborhoods are historically Black communities within the city of Houston, raising concerns about rising tax assessments and barriers to acquiring land for redevelopment. And our expensive housing system is at the same time a system which is uniquely vulnerable to a hostile climate. And there are many ways to experience this climate, and flooding is but only one. About 20% of single-family homes in Harris County are in the floodway, 100-year, 500-year floodplains, latter of which is shown in this map here. And one analysis in this year's report found that there is a significant association between a neighborhood's share of single-family homes in floodplains and that neighborhood's poverty rate, meaning, in other words, that residents with less means to respond to floods, less money to address the situation, are concentrated in flood-prone neighborhoods, or that vulnerable people live in vulnerable places. And for reference, the community with the most single-family homes in the 100-year floodplain is Elliott, and in the 500-year, it's South Belt Ellington, so in the far southeast corner of that map. And besides heavy rains and flooding, another concern is extreme heat, something I do not need to belabor to our local audience in Houston in June. And one of the realities about extreme heat, or heat in general, is that different places, based upon their landscape or plant and tree cover, experience it differently. So a hot day feels a lot worse if you're at a large open parking lot than if you're walking along a shaded path. And we process satellite imagery to map local heat islands or areas of concentrated heat on a specific high heat and cloudless day in 2024, which is a particularly hot year. And these data were then used to estimate average land temperature by neighborhood in Harris County. The results of that analysis are shown here, finding the highest land surface temperatures in the Gulfton, Eastwood, and Midtown neighborhoods. And a statistical analysis found that neighborhoods with a higher average land surface temperature were statistically significantly poorer than those with lower temperatures, meaning that households in neighborhoods that are most in need of high quality air conditioning or window sealing or insulation have less means to pay for it. Again, vulnerable households live in vulnerable places. A similar finding is also shown with disasters. So for this year's report, we included analyses on the effects of Hurricane Beryl and the 2024 derecho, analyzing the concentration of valid FEMA aid applications and 311 calls after each of those storms. And we found that it wasn't necessarily reported damage, but a neighborhood's poverty rate, which has a stronger association with the number of valid FEMA applications for aid, which is perhaps not surprising because this then other points, in total emphasize that there is no such thing as a natural disaster, or that the negative effects of climate change or extreme climate intersect with pre-existing social and economic inequities across class and race. And those inequities are reflected in the actual quality and sturdiness of the home structures themselves. We measured 4 main indicators of housing quality: central air conditioning, conventional heat source, adequate plumbing, and the median age of the home. And for example, we found in one community that more than a quarter of all homes didn't have piped in gas or electric or solar heat, and up to 5% of homes in other neighborhoods didn't have adequate indoor plumbing. What people assume is the norm in underdeveloped countries or in rural areas is actually something experienced by many people here in Harris County, the 3rd largest county in the United States. This report contains detailed data on the neighborhoods facing all these housing challenges more severely, including that one neighborhood where more than a quarter of structures didn't have conventional heat sources. And we also identified 17 neighborhoods highlighted in red in this map, where in total over 500,000 people live, which are lacking across all 4 of our multiple housing quality metrics. Our housing system is not only expensive, but in certain areas, the homes are unable to physically withstand the harmful effects of a severe climate. And the responsibility of protecting oneself from extreme weather falls on individual households who have to purchase home and flood insurance. And this year, we found that the number of flood insurance policies in the county is roughly similar to the number of homes in the floodplain. This is ostensibly good news. But when it comes to home insurance, which more typically protects from non-flood extreme weather events like wind and hail damage or burst pipes, which can happen after a freeze, homeowners coverage has gotten much more expensive, with average yearly premiums in Harris County increasing by almost $1,000 or 40% roughly in about 3 years, and a 20% increase in just 1 year. Interestingly, insurance is one area where renters still have it kind of good, as average premiums for renters have remained relatively level over the past decade. These are renters' premiums, not landlords. We also found that the affordability gap we talked about earlier, that gap between the homes that are actually out there for sale and the homes that people can afford, that gap would go up about $15,000 if home insurance rates double, which they appear to be on track to do. So the data that I shared in this presentation today, which I think questions not just the affordability, but the attractiveness of Houston as a place to live, should current trends continue, these data are only a very, very small sliver of a 40-page report. So please scan that QR code. You can read the report and also access all of the report's data in the State of Housing dashboard, which was designed by our Urban Data Platform team here at the Kinder Institute. And I want to give a very huge thank you to them, specifically to Nguyen and Christopher Brown, and also to our research analysts who did the bulk of the analysis in the report. We're Andrew Kim, Aram Yang, and Debelina Banerjee. So at that dashboard, which you can get to via that QR code, you can visualize the data. You can look up how your own neighborhood is faring by these and a few other metrics. And you can also get a link to the Urban Data Platform's data library, where you can actually download the raw numeric data yourself and do your own analyses. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to pass the lead back to Caroline, who will introduce our panelists.
Thank you so much, Steve. So let's go ahead and dive in and meet our expert panel and learn more about what this research really means for Houston. So if we could have Jeremy, Jim, and Elaine turn their cameras back on. Thank you. And could you introduce yourselves and talk about your background in housing and resilience? And we'll start with you, Elaine.
First, thank you for having me. I'm Elaine Morales. I'm the Senior Director of Partnerships and Policy at Connective. I'm also a public interest designer from Puerto Rico, which really shapes how I approach housing and resilience work. My background is in architecture and community development, which has given me the opportunity to work across housing and disaster recovery in several ways, from designing and building affordable housing to helping hurricane survivors rebuild their homes. Facilitating neighborhood-based planning efforts and working on housing and disaster recovery policy here in Texas. At Connective, my focus is more on improving how social services and disaster assistance work, so they're more accessible, equitable, and centered on those that rely on them. I've also served on the boards of the Houston Community Land Trust and the Houston Land Bank, which keeps me connected to efforts around housing development, preservation, and community resilience in our region. So glad to be here.
Thank you. Over to you, Jim.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Good, great. First of all, just big shout out to the Kinder team for doing this report, and to Elaine, who is doing amazing work along with other folks in Houston. So I don't want to project that we academics are moving into this space and are the first ones here. We're just trying to catch up. With that, my name is Jim Elliott. I'm a professor of sociology at Rice University. I'm also the co-director of a new center we formed on campus called Coastal Futures and Adaptive Resilience. In both of those places or spaces, one of the things we try to work on is the idea that we're not going to build our way out of some of these predicaments. Yes, we need more housing. Yes, we need more infrastructure to protect us from some of these climate issues, but ultimately they're about people and about the social dynamics that really sort of move through and around some of the conversations and findings that we're going to have today. So in that space, I continue to work with a number of folks here on campus. So I work with mechanical engineers, civil engineers, but also have frequent conversations with architects, with humanists, et cetera, to really think about what this challenge means, not just to Houston, but to the United States as a whole. So one of the things we focus on, you'll hear a little bit about, is how are people adapting to this, not just through policy and planning, but also as they await for that sort of solution. What are they doing in terms of housing, particularly moving around and trying to sort of find safe, affordable alternatives? So with that, I'll turn it over to Jeremy.
Great, thanks, Jim. So I'm Jeremy Porter. I am a professor of quantitative methods at the City University of New York and the director of spatial analytics at Columbia University. I'm also the lead academic collaborator with First Street, where I am the head of climate implications research. And it's really in that space that I've been working in climate and housing research space, and really focused on quantifying and communicating climate risk in a way that feels practical and accessible and useful to people in terms of understanding their risk and making climate informed decisions around that risk. A lot of the work that I've done, and you know, Jim can attest to this and others can attest to this, a lot of the work that I've done in the academic space lives in academic journals, and we have a really hard time translating that in a way that, you know, people can understand and can action against. So what we focused on at First Street is creating actionable insights in the housing space. We've built climate risk scores that are now on Zillow.com, Redfin, Realtor, Homes.com, as a way just for your everyday American to understand climate risk at their property and understand, you know, what risk is, how much risk could cost them in the future. And really that's our primary goal. Today, I'll talk a little bit about the work that we've done on understanding risk at the community level, and then how that's translating itself into the cost of home ownership, cost of insurance, and things of that nature today and into the future.
Thank you. Thank you for that. And thank you to all three of you for joining us for this and, providing us with your local knowledge and expertise. So let's dive into some of the questions. First, for Elaine. Regarding housing, we found that there are 500,000 residents living in neighborhoods that are less likely to have central AC, conventional heat, and live in older dwellings. Could you talk about some of the top three, maybe the top 3 to 4 challenges and impacts that come to mind when you think about these conditions?
Of course, and unfortunately, these findings are not surprising, based on what we face in Houston and Harris County. When I think about the top 3 to 4 challenges, the first one that comes to mind is the health risks that arise from inadequate housing in the face of extreme heat and cold. For those with medical conditions, children, or older adults, lacking AC is life-threatening. Heat is the leading cause of weather-related deaths, making reliable cooling a critical public health issue. This risk is amplified by the grid failures that we lived through after Winter Storm Uri, and even last year after the Derecho and Hurricane Beryl, with many of our neighbors and ourselves spend more than 48 hours without power. Second, I think of the housing stock deterioration and the impact on affordability. When we look at Houston and Harris County, much of our housing is aging in ways that create serious risks, especially for those with limited resources. Over 1 million of homes were built before the 90s. 1 in 5 rental units are rated below average. So these older homes have often failing systems, no weatherization, which leave families more vulnerable and uncomfortable during extreme weather. But also, many of those deteriorating units are remaining naturally occurring affordable housing, homes that low and moderate income families depend on. But as we let them go into despair, we risk losing them to the market, which results in less affordable units that all these families are currently living at, which means more displacement and less stability. And third, I think about the compounding effects of disasters. Our disaster risk exacerbates the pressures on our housing stock. With each storm, flood, or freeze, more families are pushing to crisis. In 2021, we surveyed homeowners, and the majority of them had experienced 2.2 disasters. And since then, we've had more disasters. And what we saw was that half of them were spending over $10,000 on repairs. 60% of them were relying on savings or loans just to recover. Yet the scale of the unmet need keeps growing. When we look at Harvey, over 24,000 units that needed housing recovery were left behind. We added more with Winter Storm Uri, and just this month, Houston estimated 230 million in unmet need housing needs after Beryl and Derecho, yet allocated $0 for housing recovery. So unless available assistance is prioritized for housing recovery and proactive repairs, these gaps will widen, putting thousands of more families at risk. And this is, also in the face of the economic hardship and lack of policy protections that we faced in Texas. Over 700,000 residents in Harris County struggle to make ends meet. Wages have stagnated in Texas, costs keep rising, and policy gaps are leaving more families without protection. When we look at the Texas law for implied warranty of habitability, it's very vague. There's no clear guidelines for safe cooling, heating, or mold remediation. When we see people that, experience floods and applied for FEMA and they didn't keep up their FEMA insurance, then they're at risk of not receiving more aid the next time they flood. So many families are trapped in this cycle of risk. And we know that safe, healthy, affordable housing is fundamental for stability and opportunity. So we shouldn't leave that to individual means or the market to decide who has it.
Thank you. Thank you for that, Elaine. Super insightful thinking about, the issues of risk and really who are the vulnerable populations. Jim, I wonder if you might respond to some of Elaine's comments, particularly as she talks about, that sort of cycle of risk as she described it and how that intersects with some of the work that you have been doing and what you've been finding.
Yeah, no, the work again, Elaine and her folks are doing is so important because it shines a light exactly where we need to in this space, which is oftentimes forgotten by planners or other folks who sort of go about their business. One of the things that we sort of think about at the CFAR Center that I mentioned is how people are responding, right? So you can think of housing as vulnerable people in vulnerable places or something on a continuum there, but then it also becomes a question of, well, then what happens when these affordable housing units, deteriorate even quicker due to climate effects or to, you know, lack of upkeep, et cetera. So we've been trying to think about and do research in Houston, but also nationwide, but I'll focus on Houston on what are the neighborhoods and spaces that are adapting as we think about the people in the homes and where are they going. And you can imagine in certain communities like Meyerland or Bel Air, other ones where there's a lot of flooding, but people have resources, moving and evidence of that moving might be very different than in other places where the resources might not be as great. And so you start to face challenges of that instability as you move forward.
So, thanks for that, Jim. When we're talking about housing, we're not just talking about the physical structures, right? We're talking about the families and individuals moving through these structures, the population flows, if you will. And increasingly in Houston, at least, these flows are being shaped by climate hazards, as more intense storms and flooding. So, my question for you, Jim, is what do we know about how Houstonians are moving in response to these challenges?
Yeah, thanks, Caroline. Right. So this gets back to sort of a brief sort of step back. As sociologists, and I think other social scientists, when you think of Houston, we don't think of it as just a place. We think of it as a node of flows. People are moving back and forth from home to work, going to bus terminals, et cetera. Um, and they're also flowing through houses. So we need to think of these neighborhoods and Houston as both places and processes. So in that, we think about what are the processes of movement and sort of people shifting homes as they respond to some of these challenges. And so in that, we've done a fair amount of research, as I mentioned, but I'll focus on two sort of sets of findings, maybe more pertinent to Houston. So we, like a number of folks after Hurricane Harvey, were interested, okay, is this causing more housing instability? How do we look at this? And so members of our team, Alex Priest in particular, went through the hard work of gathering millions of points of data for how people were moving before Harvey, and then doing the sophisticated modeling and looking what happens afterwards. And in short, what we found is that, you know, neighborhoods, people were moving after Harvey. It looked like it was in response, but they weren't really moving that much more commonly or frequently than they were before Harvey, with one big exception. If you were a neighborhood that had a majority of residents who were people of color, not white, and you had severe storm impact, then your neighborhood was different. It began to have a lot more movement, not just in the first year after Harvey, not just in the second, but in the third. And so we have these knock-on effects where we begin to see the realities that while we might think of ourselves as Houston strong and realize that we as sort of an area and a citizenry are facing down some of the same sort of heat concerns and flood concerns, their impacts on communities are very different in terms of stability. And a lot of that has to do, I think, with some of the issues that Elaine mentioned, which is this, the some of the housing just becomes to a point where you can't rent it anymore, or you can't live there anymore, and you're forced to move. So with that, we begin to think about how do we plan and move forward with some of these housing initiatives so we can provide better affordable housing alternatives where we can have opportunities for people to move to safer spaces, plan in advance. And so one of the things we've also done is looked into home buyout programs. Very complex subject, but as some of the audience members might know, Houston is considered to be one of the capitals of federally funded buyouts or home purchases to remove people from hazardous housing in these climate threatened places. And so we've been studying these processes nationwide. But in Houston, what we found, one of the interesting findings is that you've got a policy that's being enacted across a lot of different types of neighborhoods. But what happens as people decide whether they're going to sort of participate in this buyout program, leave their home and go someplace safer in the metro area, sort of you find that people moving from whiter and more affluent neighborhoods are able to stay closer to their neighborhood. They're also able to stay closer to each other. So in a real sense, they're able to maintain the social value of their community, even as they just adjust to the new housing challenges that our climate threats present. In other neighborhoods that are less affluent and primarily places where people of color live, what we find is the opposite. When people finally have to move, they have to make a choice. Do I stay with my community and stay close, or do I move far away? And typically they move much farther, not only from their community and home, but also from each other. And so you have an erosion or deterioration of the social value of that community as people are adapting. So as Steve said, and it's important to keep in mind, it is in large part about vulnerable people, if you will, they're also very resilient, right? These are people who've been fighting the good fight and hard fight for a long time. So it's not that they lack resources and know-how. So oftentimes they don't have the financial resources to go through this. But as they face these challenges and work through the same policies and the same climate threats that other communities do, they face very different outcomes that begin to further deteriorate and erode some of the resources they have, including their social capital and their community connections. And this is something that I know Jeremy and his work at First Stream Foundation has been looking at a lot in terms of how do insurance costs figure into this? How do rising costs, and what does this mean for which communities will be able to sort of stay where they are and which ones will be forced to move?
Thank you for that, Jim. It gives us a lot to think about in terms of, the spatial dynamics of where people are going and how climate is really impacting these population flows, especially because one of the things that we found in the report is that half of Harris County neighborhoods actually lost population within the last ACS period. But Jeremy, I wanted to give you a chance to respond to some of the things that Jim said about these population flows and these shifts over space and time, really, and how that is kind of impacting the work or showing up in the work that you do.
Yeah, and in two different places, I think I really appreciate Jim and Elaine's local knowledge of the dynamics that are occurring in Houston specifically. We've been looking at this at a higher level, looking primarily across the country and trying to understand the relationship between climate risk, be it flood, wildfire, extreme winds, heat, drought, and air quality from wildfire smoke, and how that's historically correlated with population change. And so we've done that. We built a series of models. And then tried to build what we would think of as a location desirability model that includes a full suite of amenities and disamenities in communities. So things that we know pull people into neighborhoods, things that we know push people out of neighborhoods. And what we found aligns really, really well with what we're hearing from the previous two speakers. It's that neighborhoods that are really strong sociodemographically, socioeconomically, less vulnerable populations, they tend to be more resilient to climate risk. They tend to be able to adapt. They tend to have the capacity for organization, for adaptation, even at the community level, to help protect the assets that are in those communities. So we end up seeing, in a lot of cases, that climate risk is important in terms of being a predictor of where folks are going to be impacted, what these population flows look like, but you can't look at it in a vacuum. You have to understand what the local conditions are in these communities, how people are adapting to those communities, and what sort of the socioeconomic characteristics of the community is in terms of their ability to adapt. And that was really one of the major findings that came out of a report that we put out earlier this year. We zoomed into a series of metro areas, Houston, for instance. We saw relatively straightforward patterns in terms of population change. When you zoom in, you look at the data at a high resolution level. We're talking about block groups or census tracts, something we think of as like a neighborhood, essentially. And we essentially saw losses in populations in portions of the southeastern part of the city. So you started to see places around Buffalo Bayou and some of these places that we know have significant levels of flood risk. And we saw population growth in the northwestern parts of the county. So there were changes and dynamics in the city. If we went back and looked from 2000 to 2024, specifically, that was our historic period. focus, but it aligned and correlated really well with flood risk in particular in that area. Not that other parts don't have that kind of flood risk, but disproportionately we saw that risk in certain parts of the city where we were seeing population change disproportionately go negative versus other parts of the city. And the other thing we've seen is when people have this information, they're making climate informed decisions. It's just that a lot of people don't have information. They don't understand what their climate risk is because we haven't made it easy for people outside of the academic world and outside of the research centers and think tanks and places like that. And we ran a controlled treatment design test with our data on redfin.com. And essentially what we did is we exposed half the people that came to the site to our flood risk data. We didn't expose the other half of the people to the data. And what we found was that people that were exposed to the data systematically searched for lower risk properties. But the interesting thing was they didn't look far. To Jim's point, they wanted to stay close to family, close to their social networks. They wanted to keep the same jobs. So they were searching for homes that maybe instead of a flood risk of 8 were a flood risk of 4 or 5 or something like that. But people are making climate informed decisions. We just have to make sure that we're giving people that information.
Here I am now. Thanks for that, Jeremy. And you're completely right. You know, the sort of simple, the low hanging fruit of this, which tends to be more difficult, is getting the information into the right hands of people, right? So, and this actually gets to one of our audience comments too, from Michelle Posey, when her comments on insurance. And I'm wondering, Jeremy, if you can comment on, you know, we know that the rising cost of insurance is impacting affordability, right? And we know that flood insurance uptake is also troublesome in Harris County, particularly 80% of households not having flood insurance. Can you speak a little bit on the relationship between climate and insurance, particularly here in the Gulf Coast region?
Yeah, and I think a lot of there are a couple of core components to this. One is knowledge around flood risk, and it's actually mapping and disseminating information around flood risk to homeowners in a way that they can understand. Across the country, what we found was that FEMA shows about 7.8 million properties are in FEMA's what they call a special flood hazard area, or the 1 in 100-year flood zone. We ran our own model at First Street. We ended up finding that there's about 17.9 million properties with that same level of risk. So there's about 2.2 times as much risk across the country as what we know from our authoritative flood zone boundaries from the FEMA SFHAs. And really that comes down to a methodological issue. We won't dig into it in this webinar, but FEMA doesn't map heavy precipitation, and heavy precipitation risk is one of the driving causes of flooding that we've seen across the country. Houston, one of the places where we've seen that. And FEMA's really good on main river channels. They're really good in coastal storm surge areas, less good in heavy precipitation risk areas. So we end up seeing this gap in terms of knowledge around flood risk. And because of that gap, we're seeing that when people get mortgages, they're not being told by their banks that they need to have flood insurance. They're not being told that they live in a flood zone and it's a mandate as part of their mortgage requirements. So people don't get flood insurance. So part of that gap that we're seeing is simply the fact that we're not mapping flood risk properly, and we're not integrating that risk into the mortgage system and other places where we can try to mandate some of the flood insurance coverage, or at least reduce some of the gap that we're seeing today. Another issue is that within the NFIP in particular, again, if there's 7.8 million properties that are in flood zones, property owners should know they're in flood zones. Still today, we only have about 4.2 million properties with NFIP policies in force. So even amongst those that are in flood zones and know they should have flood insurance, folks don't. Some of that is due to the recent what's called a risk rating 2.0 adjustment to the pricing algorithm that FEMA implemented, where they moved from their old pricing structure, which really did in a lot of ways subsidize flood risk and move the cost of living in flood risky areas to the federal government. They've moved it over to the property owners. And in some places in coastal Texas, coastal Louisiana, we saw increases in the old pricing algorithm to the new pricing algorithm of over 700%. You can imagine being a homeowner, living in your home, maybe you're paying your mortgage, and all of a sudden you have an additional 700% increase in your insurance. Most people aren't going to be able to do that. They have one choice, well, they have two choices. sell the home, try to move somewhere else where you can afford the flood insurance, or go without flood insurance and self-insure. And unfortunately, our drop down to 4.2 million policies across the country indicates that a lot of people are going without flood insurance now. So there is this under protection from flood risk that we see across the country. And then in Houston and in the Gulf Coast in particular, there's also a lot of wind risk in the area. And so what we've seen are that homeowners insurance companies are raising rates rapidly, or they're pushing people off of the private insurance policies and onto what are called state-sponsored or residual insurance plans. And so you'll see things like the Citizens Insurance plan in Louisiana, the State Fair plan, which exists in a number of states across the country. But that's become a market that's growing relatively rapidly because private insurance companies, they exist as private companies to in their mind make a profit. Their business. They're trying to grow their own revenue, but they can't charge an actuarially sound insurance rate with some of the state regulations that are put in place to protect consumers and to protect homeowners, so that homeowners don't see rapidly rising insurance rates. But part of that latent consequence really is that people are removed from their private insurance, moved on to these state insurance, state-sponsored insurance residual plans, and right away they're seeing 2 or 3 times the increase in their insurance costs. So we're really seeing it both in the flood space, and we're seeing it in the homeowners insurance space. And just as a way to think about where Houston sits, relative sort of national changes. Nationally, we've seen since 2019 to 2024, we went back and looked at all the state insurance filings that came out of all of the private insurance companies. Every insurance office requires a public filing to be filed, and it's a pain to go through and try to pull the data out of. But ultimately, what we found was there's about a 25% increase in insurance costs from 2019 to 2024, about a 35% increase across Texas, and about a 70% increase in the filings in Houston specifically. So Houston's seeing almost a 3 times increase in homeowners insurance costs versus what we're seeing across the rest of the country. And as we start to project that out into the future, a lot of what we do at First Street's focused on these increases in climate risk and understanding how those increases are going to impact our exposure to flood, to wind, to wildfire, heat, drought, et cetera. And we're seeing 3-4 times increase out the next 30 years in terms of insurance premiums, just based in today's dollars. So the risk is going to continue to grow, and it's really on us to figure out and start to understand, what do we do in these spaces where we have so much infrastructure and economic investment and development in a place like Houston. Houston's not going to pick up and move to Duluth, Minnesota. I mean, you hear this all the time as everybody's moving to these climate havens. Houston's going to adapt as much as it can because of all of the investment in the area. It's important for us to start to take that information into account and start to think about what are the smartest ways we can adapt to the risks we have today, but let's future-proof it. Let's build for what the climate's going to be like in 30 years, and let's figure out how do we adapt in areas that maybe are more vulnerable or less socioeconomically able to do it on their own.
No, that's perfect. And that goes along with our, what we talk about, vulnerable people live in vulnerable places. And Jim, I actually liked your reframing of that idea too, that, these are vulnerable people and communities, but they're also very resilient too, right? And so that pushes us more towards this conversation of responses and how people are actually reacting to the dynamics that the three of you so expertly laid out. But before we open it up to audience Q&As, I wanted to give Jim and Elaine a chance to respond to some of the dynamics that Jeremy laid out in terms of affordability and its impact on the development of communities and neighborhoods in the context of Houston and Harris County and the Gulf in general.
I feel like Elaine should have the opportunity to back clean up here. She's earned it. I'll just hit a couple points. One, the points Jeremy makes, there's this idea, if you're fortunate enough to have insurance as it's rising in cost, that's great, but it ignores a couple things. One is there are increasingly clauses about what will be covered and what will be covered. And this is what's going to be the new frontier, right? And so in that, a couple things. One is expect trauma and drama anytime these things happen. Even when you have insurance, the home insurance policies are going to be fighting with the flood insurance policies, and they're going to be saying, no, you pay this, you pay that. In the meantime, to go back to one of Steve's points, there's this sort of notion that, oh, well, renters will be okay, and most of Houston folks are renters, but those renters are also paying homeowners insurance. I'm a renter. I'm fortunate. I work at Rice. I can afford what my landlord does, but effectively, my landlord comes and says, my insurance rates are going up. You will pay higher rent. And I go, okay, please don't make me move. And we go through that. But in the process of that, the devil becomes increasingly in the details, because some of those fights that I mentioned are about preconditioned conditions. So if you're living in housing that is not up to code, or is lacking AC, or has some of these qualities or conditions that were highlighted in the report, then the fights get even more contested, because why should we, the insurance company or other folks, pay to fix up your house when it was already in sort of these conditions otherwise? And so we begin to have a very complicated system in which simply having insurance, although that's important, becomes more and more complicated, especially in neighborhoods that are struggling with housing quality and rents to begin with. Elaine?
What came to mind was the consequences of insurance costs rising. I want to chat a bit about deductibles. From the 269 repairs we coordinated after Hurricane Beryl, about half of the applicants had insurance but could not afford their deductible. So that means that, more people are going to need public and nonprofit support after disasters to actually recover, even though they have insurance, but they cannot afford the assistance. I'm also seeing affordable housing developers step away from low-income housing tax credit projects because of rising insurance costs, which means that the incentives to build new affordable housing are shrinking because of these premiums. And then I wanted to touch on, about moving away from risk when we think specifically about single family homeowners. I think after Harvey, we all learned that if it rains in Houston, it can flood, even if you're in a floodway 100 year or 500 year. So for many homeowners, their home is their wealth, their dream, the American dream. So there's a lot of emotional response when people hear you have to move from this disaster risk, even for those that are aware of that risk, because they don't see or trust that the next place is going to be safe either. So when thinking about retreat, buyouts, these processes have to be supportive and fair of that. I know that we sometimes do comparables of the amount of rooms they have, the amount of bathrooms, and then finding a comparable home. But there's also that emotional piece of how do we bring wraparound services and community to feel like I'm actually protective if I make this decision.
Thank you. Thank you for that. So I want to get to some of the audience Q&A questions. First, we had and not surprisingly, a lot of the questions, I should say, are focused on solutions and impact and responses, and what can we do to address the challenges that we're facing, both on the housing side as well as the climate side. Before I turn it over to the three of you, I wanted to address some of the audience questions, and Steve Sherman, you should also feel free to jump in here as well. That in terms of one of the questions about what solutions Harris County is doing about how the lack of zoning or culture of redevelopment contribute to people being displaced from their neighborhoods and resources to respond to that. I just wanted to give a plug to one tool that I had personal success using from the Houston Chronicle to contest your property appraisal. It's a great tool that they just rolled out this year that, for people at all levels of income and location and geography can really take advantage of to try to help lower your property taxes at sort of the most simple level. So I encourage everybody to check that out. We will post a link to that in the chat, so you can definitely take a look at it, and it's very approachable and simplistic. And then I also wanted to mention too, the use or a number of sort of local nonprofits here in Houston and Harris County that are trying to implement changes like Houston Habitat for Humanity, that are implementing a number of changes in the homes that they're building to be more adaptive and be more climate resilient in terms of, going the extra mile to put hurricane-proof roofs on their structures, as well as implement a number of other sort of structural changes to the ways that they build, that really kind of try to get ahead of some of these challenges that we're facing. But also, so to turn it over to the three panelists that we have, some of the questions that we have really are focused on the policy level of what policymakers can do and where they can direct their resources to best implement some of these changes, as well as some of the more technical aspects of zoning regulations, and financing. So first, I wanted to get to Catherine Byers' question of where can the city of Houston direct federal and any future local resources in order to best protect the social cohesion and future resilience of communities of color. And Jim, you kind of touched on this a little bit in your response. So I thought you could kick us off with that.
Yes. So I'll just preface with what I think we already know, which is, what do they say? For every complex challenge, there's a simple solution, and it's wrong. So we're going to need a lot of different approaches to this, right? And so one of those is going to be working with the communities in question, and that involves, well, what does that work involve? So the risks that we've been talking about are immediate in the sense that we're about to enter into a hurricane season and it's hot, and so they feel real, but we need to engage in that long-term planning. And I remember shortly after Harvey experience, and the Kinder Institute invited a number of experts on home relocation and adaptation to have a conversation. And what they sort of reported back, at least at that time, was the most important element is not the specific program, but an overarching plan for how you're going to approach these things. So think long term about these things. And that's difficult, but I would say that's the major solution that needs to wrap around all of this, which is to say, how can we build affordable housing near folks that is safe? And so begin to involve architects, say at Rice, or planners, and thinking about the Houston Land Bank and others who can begin to think about scalable alternatives rather than the policies we typically have, which are individualistic. Do you want to move or not? It's up to you to figure out how. Or in the case that we're increasingly going, if people decide, because of what Elaine's talking about, maybe to stay tight, hold on to the resources they have because they're not really sure the city is going to provide for them, not necessarily go into a mandatory buyout or relocation process without enough care and thinking about what it means to move and to provide the safer housing that Jeremy pointed out. Because what we find in our own research is that the climate threat and the cost threat are not sufficient enough necessarily to make people move. They have to have somewhere to move to. And so that's going to be our big challenge. How does Houston build places to move to while it maintains its local tax base?
Thanks for that. Elaine, Jeremy, did you want to respond to that as well?
Sure. I think that it's time that our local governments invest in whole home repair programs and retrofits at scale. Not all the housing stock is going to move, to higher ground, or so how can we expand efforts like blue sky repairs, retrofits, weatherization, lead abatement, that can, address and preserve some of the housing that maybe it doesn't flood, but it's been impacted so much, or if it floods, what resilient repairs we can consider to keep people there. I think that we have to strengthen our habitability protections at the state and local levels include clear enforceable standards for working AC, heat, clean water, especially in extreme weather zones like ours that, mold is everywhere. So how do we receive investments for that?
Now,
Thanks
I'll
for
just,
that.
Caroline.
Oh, I was
Uh,
going to say, Jeremy, I was going to ask you to respond, if you could respond to those comments as well. But we also had a question that was specifically for you about what happens when, with the updates, the hopefully eventual updates to the FEMA flood maps that are soon to be released, and that will account for higher rainfall per hour, and how will this affect the discrepancy you spoke of? But first, if you could, react to the sort of question about social communities.
Absolutely. And I think they actually work well together. I think the way there's a finite amount of resources for these types of things. And I think the way that we do it effectively and efficiently is we need good data. We need good high resolution data that allows us to understand where are the communities where we should be implementing these types of adjustments, these types of whole house retrofits and adjustments, as Elaine mentioned, sort of thinking about the adjustments to housing and where individuals live, where they could relocate to, that Jim mentioned. All of these are solutions, but when you look at it from a policy perspective, you look at Houston, and there are ways in which you can start to think about the pockets of Houston and where you can allocate those resources, but really having good data to drive that decision process would again, theoretically, I think I saw in the QA, we want actionable decisions, not theoretical ways to think about it, but theoretically it would help us think about how do we streamline this process and get the money in the hands of the people that can use the money to make the biggest impact in this space. So really understanding climate, I think it dovetails nicely into the other question that you mentioned, Caroline. One of the primary issues right now is around flood maps and us not understanding flood risk appropriately, not only in Houston, but across the country. And there isn't at this point an expectation that FEMA is going to update the SFHA maps themselves. I mean, they have changed the NFIP pricing algorithm, and underlying that pricing algorithm is a risk-based map that takes into account precipitation and all forms of flood risk, which means now if you live outside of a flood zone, you could have a really high insurance rate if you ask for an NFIP rate, even though there's no public way of understanding that you're in a flood zone or not. So there is some miscommunication there in terms of actually communicating flood risk and paying for that flood risk. But NOAA, which keeps and creates the precipitation estimates, which is one of the primary drivers of the big gap in flood risk that we see across the country. I think like almost 70% of the miss between our flood map and FEMA's flood zones, there's heavy precipitation risk and small waterway flooding, creeks, tributaries, etc. And NOAA keeps a precipitation record, which also doesn't correct for climate risk. Right now, the 1 in 100 year rainfall rate in parts of the country, I'm thinking of the Ohio Valley in particular, the 1 in 100 year rainfall rate occurs every 8 years if you climate adjust for the actual rate. So, both, climate correcting these authoritative pieces that drive things like infrastructure development, stormwater management development, all of the infrastructure that's put into a city like Houston relies on those NOAA Atlas 14 precipitation records, and they're not climate corrected for our current risk. So we should be building that type of infrastructure to not only today's risk, but to the future risk. So it's not outdated immediately as we built that. So I would just sort of summarize it as sort of the effective and efficient allocation of resources by using high quality data to understand where we can make the biggest impact with the resources that are available, but then climate correcting and future proofing these types of decisions for the future. We're pretty well baked in over the next 30 years. We know what the climate is going to look like. There's not much we can do, even if we go to a zero emissions level over the next 30 years. So really what we need to do is understand in this short term, how are we going to future proof and adapt to that climate? And then we can look further out as we're doing things like adjusting carbon emissions and things of that nature for a longer term expectation.
That's actually a perfect segue to the last question. And I'm going to put all three of you kind of in the hot seat for a second, in 1 minute or less. If you could respond to a question that we received from Mary Garrett, which really kind of summarizes everything of what are some things we can do to lower the cost to maintain homeownership with the high cost of home insurance, flood insurance, and development in the greater Houston area? And Jim, we will come back around to you first.
Oh my. Okay, let's see if I can cool down the hot seat for the my co-host. So, I'm not an economist, but it's pretty clear that they're going to be short-term and long-term costs, right? And so part of that has to do with, can we get assistance in a massive way, probably that's needed from our state legislature and our federal government to begin taking these things seriously. We all pay into the tax system. It seems like a reasonable thing for our elected officials to begin to think about how we can provide short-term incentives to plan a smarter, longer future. Now, I get that that sounds theoretical, but my understanding as well is that there are certain things you can do to lower the flood insurance costs, for instance. You can have more people divulge whether or not their home is flooded in the past when they go through real estate transactions, right? But there are certain things that local governments are unwilling to do to lower those risks. So part of it's beginning to think about what are the tools we have at hand that we can do a better job of. I agree with Jeremy as someone who looks at the data and pays attention to that being able to figure out where we can steer the resources to maximum effect is important. And so in that, I think the major question is equality or equity. And I think you can make the biggest bang for the buck where the need is greatest, not where people have the most value in their home that's potentially lost. So flipping the script on how we think about prioritizing the limited resources we have will go a long way.
Thank you. Over to Elaine, 1 minute or less.
I'm going to try, but I'd be remiss to not mention that in the face of public services and assistance being at risk at the federal level, local governments have to start mapping that cliff of like what is the growing need locally when those available resources are not there, and really investing in better connecting eligible households with current and new services in response to that. Like I believe that if all families that are eligible to SNAP, Medicaid, the Harris County Gold Card, if we increase opportunities for utility relief, rental assistance locally, then families will be better prepared to pay for insurance or to pay for repairs. And finally, I would say like advocacy, like let's remind the city, the county, the state decision makers that housing matters and social services matter and that they deserve priority investments. And you all have an opportunity to attend today the last online meeting from the Housing and Community Development Department on the action plan post-burial and derecho. So go there and tell them that social services and housing are priority investments to make.
Thank you. And over to Jeremy to close us out.
Yeah, and I scooped myself on my last answer. I think that it really is about, creating high resolution, high quality, rigorous data, quantifying and communicating the risk and getting it into the hands of people, both at the policy level, but also the community level that know and understand how the resources should be implemented to make the biggest impact on those communities. So it really is around, we need to measure climate risk properly and understand the implications of climate risk.
Thank you. And thank you again to our panelists for being with us today and such a great conversation. Thank you also to our audience for your engagement with our research. We had a number of really fantastic questions in our Q&A, and we unfortunately weren't able to get to all of them, but hopefully we got to some of them. And last but certainly not least, we thank Wells Fargo for their support of this webinar and the report. And we also invite you to join us for our next event on July 16th, which will focus on the impact of Houston's changing demographics on the schools, districts, and organizations, providing support to an evolving student population. And finally, a reminder to please download and explore the report, our data dashboard, and our other housing research at kinder.rice.edu. Where you'll actually, I think, find a lot of answers to some of the questions that we weren't able to get to in the Q&A. So thank you all, and we hope to see you soon.